Hello everyone, welcome to Brainstorm Lore and welcome back to the Targaryen conquest of Westeros. When we last left off, Aegon Targaryen had just proclaimed himself king of all Westeros and had made the risky move of dividing his forces. The greater part of his army, under the command of his younger sister wife Rhaenys and his new hand of the king Aerys Baratheon, was to move south and attack the Stormlands. The Targaryen navy, under the command of the Admiral Daemon Valerian and Aegon's elder sister wife Visenya, were to go north and attack the Vale. Meanwhile, Aegon himself, with a smaller portion of his land army, would move into the Riverlands to confront Harren the Black and his Ironborn. Unfortunately for the Targaryen cause, Visenya's first attempt to conquer the Vale ended in failure, as the Targaryen navy was almost irreparably crippled by the Valemen of Gulltown. Visenya ultimately paid them back for this by setting their own ships on fire, but it ultimately didn't make the Battle of Gulltown any less of a defeat for the Targaryen cause. Meanwhile, south and west in the Riverlands, Aegon was having slightly better luck than his elder sister, though that's not to say that he wasn't encountering a few problems of his very own. The Targaryen forces had recently won a victory south of the God's Eye against the Ironborn at the Battle of the Reeds. Now it was time to relax and recuperate from that fight. It was late evening, the men were sitting around the fire, eating, drinking, resting, repairing their weapons and armor, when suddenly the Ironborn were in their rear. Two of Harren the Black's sons, using muffled oars in the growing cover of darkness, had snuck across the lake and launched a surprise attack on the unwary enemy. By the time Aegon was able to get a coherent idea of what was going on, it was already too late. Hundreds of his men had been killed, and the Ironborn were in retreat back across the lake. Still, even if Aegon Targaryen could not prevent the attack, he could avenge it, because no matter how good the Ironborn may be with boats, there was simply no way they were going to outrun a dragon, let alone one of the size and power of Balerion the Black Dread. The boats burned, and so did the Ironborn. Once again, Aegon's enemies simply had no way to counter literal flying, fire-breathing monsters. Still, Harren the Black might have held out longer than he ultimately did if it weren't for what happened after the Wailing Willows. By winning the Battle of the Reeds, and then burning the Ironborn that attacked him at the Wailing Willows, Aegon had shown that he was very good at killing Ironborn. Such a feat could only have endeared him to both the nobility and the small folk of the Riverlands, whom the Ironborn had been enslaving and abusing for going on 3 generations. After suffering under their rule for so long, the Riverlanders were doubtless desperate enough that they were willing to take their chances with this foreigner and his dragons. Edmund Tully of Riverrun was the first lord to pledge allegiance to Aegon Targaryen. But soon every family in the Riverlands, the Freys, the Blackwoods, the Brackens, the Strongs, the Mallisters, everybody was swearing fealty to the Targaryen cause. Suddenly finding himself outnumbered by Aegon and his new friends, Harren withdrew to his namesake fortress and readied himself for a siege. Aegon the Conqueror was a consummate warrior, but that did not mean that he was above using diplomacy if it could get him what he wanted. And so, after Aegon and his new Riverland allies had surrounded Harrenhal, he offered to treat with the Ironborn king. Unfortunately, the peace talks didn't go anywhere. Harren asserted confidently that the thick stone walls of his castle would allow him to defy Aegon's dragon, while Aegon begged to differ. The Targaryen conqueror waited until the fall of night and the rising of the moon, and then, either purely for dramatic effect or this simply being an exaggeration by later chroniclers, took Balerion to fly absurdly high above the castle. Balerion is described as the largest Targaryen dragon that ever lived. His teeth are said to be as long as sword blades, his mouth so wide it could swallow a woolly mammoth, his wings so vast that it could throw entire towns into shadow. Aegon took him up so high that, according to the chroniclers, the great black dragon was no bigger than a fly against the moon. And then, at Aegon's command, Balerion descended upon Harrenhal and unleashed his fire. The flames of Balerion the Black Dread are described as black shot through with red. And while the stone walls themselves did not burn, as Harren the Black had claimed, everything else certainly did. Whether they were the vast stores of food, or any Ironborn soldiers luckless enough to be manning the walls. But Balerion didn't stop there. He continued to pour fire onto the castle throughout the night. The heat was so great that all sources agree that runnels of molten stone were said to be running down the sides of the walls, and the 5 great towers of Harrenhal were said to have glowed like 5 great red candles against the night sky. The thick walls that Harren believed would be his sanctuary instead became an oven. Harren the Black roasted to a crisp, as did his sons, and when they died, so too did House Hora of the Iron Islands. With their leaders dead and the vengeful Riverlanders hot on their heels, the Ironborn were forced to flee to their ships and back to their craggy, windswept islands. All their territorial gains in mainland Westeros had been wiped away just like that. Of course, with House Hora rendered extinct, there was no one to bend the knee to Aegon. But the self-proclaimed king of Westeros was not a particularly picky man, and swiftly settled on the next best thing. And so, Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun was rewarded for his alacrity. Because he was the first of the River Lords to declare for Aegon, the Conqueror bestowed upon House Tully the title Lords Paramount of the Trident, making them the effective overlords of all the Riverlands. Presumably, the members of House Frey spent the next 3 centuries kicking themselves for that missed opportunity. At any rate, 1 kingdom down, 6 to go. And so, last but not least, we catch up with Queen Rhaenys and the army under the command of Aerys Baratheon. We're not given an exact timeline for the events of the conquest, but we do know that before the main body of the Targaryen army had crossed the river Wendwater into the Stormlands, word had already reached Argilac the Arrogant of the burning of Harrenhal and the fate of Harren the Black. Unlike Harren, though, Argilac's lords were loyal to him, and 3, Lords Errol, Fell, and Buckler, chose to ambush the Targaryen forces as they crossed the Wendwater, killing over 1,000 of the enemy before retreating back under the cover of the Kingswood Forest. Hiding from a dragon in a forest. They may as well have begged Rhaenys to burn them all, and she was more than happy to oblige. We know that at least Lord Errol was among those who perished, though Lords Fell and Buckler were able to escape with their lives and send word to King Argilac of what had just happened, and what was coming his way. Now, Storm's End, the traditional seat of House Durrandon, was, and arguably still is, the strongest castle in all of Westeros. According to legend, it had been built to resist the might of the gods of sea and wind. But when Argilac heard that he would have his own fire-breathing monster to deal with, like Harren had, he resolved not to die as the Ironborn king had, roasted alive in his own walls. Win or lose, the last Storm King vowed that his fate would be decided in battle. It didn't take long for Rhaenys, flying atop of Meraxes, to see the massive Stormlander army heading their way. And so the Targaryens prepared themselves for the coming battle. Argilac outnumbered his enemies 2-1 and had a 4-1 advantage in cavalry. In order to counter this, Baratheon positioned his army on 3 hills south of Bronzegate, giving them the advantage of the high ground. As the 2 armies readied themselves for what became known as the Battle of the Last Storm, the tempest that would give the fight its name began to blow. Argilac, enraged at the sight of enemy banners on his own land, and seeing that the storm was blowing the rain into his enemy's eyes, ignored all cautions against battle and ordered a charge. Twice the Stormland cavalry attempted the hills, but the heavy rain had churned the slopes into mud, and so the charge faltered, lost cohesion, and foundered. The Stormlanders had better luck when they deployed the infantry on the 3rd charge, and soon the tide of battle began to swing in Argilac's favor, as first one hill and then another fell to him. Argilac himself led a combined cavalry and infantry charge to take the 3rd and final hill. After many hours of hard fighting, they finally broke through the Baratheon lines, only to find Rhaenys and her dragon waiting for them. The heavy winds of the storm ensured that Meraxes was grounded, but apparently the rain did not in any way dampen his fire, and many a Stormlander roasted in his armor that day. Argilac was thrown from his own horse and had to defend himself on foot. Still, the old king hadn't lost his touch entirely. By the time Aerys Baratheon finally confronted him in the climactic duel of the battle, The old Storm King was fighting off 6 men, while 6 others lay dead at his feet. Baratheon called on Argilac to surrender. The old king simply cursed him. Presumably, the curse had something to do with Baratheon's mother. And the two engaged in mortal combat. Both were fearsome fighters, but in the end, Argilac's age proved the decisive factor, and he died as he had lived, with a sword in his hand. The Stormlanders surrendered, and as soon as the Targaryen host had recovered its strength, it immediately marched on Storm's End. To their surprise, they found the gates barred against them. Argilac's only daughter, Argella, was apparently as stubborn as her father. I like to think that this is where Stannis in particular gets it from. Declaring herself the Storm Queen, Argella informed Aerys Baratheon that the only things he would have of her would be bones, blood, and ash. Unfortunately, the new Storm Queen had reckoned without the fear of her own garrison. Hopelessly outnumbered, surrounded, and with a fire-breathing dragon ready to cook them inside their walls the way Harren had been, they were not so willing to die on the altar of Argella's pride. And so, that night, a bemused Aerys Baratheon found Argella, naked, chained, gagged, and lying at his feet. Now, given what a cynical universe A Song of Ice and Fire is, what happened next is a little strange. Instead of simply claiming the former princess as a war prize, Baratheon chose to be decent to her, covering her with his cloak, giving her wine, and speaking kindly to her. This could be the fact that Aerys Baratheon was simply a decent man. Alternatively, he could be a politically savvy man. After all, simply raping their former princess would hardly endear the Stormlanders to him, and by extension to Aegon. So, whether out of chivalry or political necessity, Aerys Baratheon made Argella Durrandon an offer. Granted, it was an offer that she was in no position to refuse, but hey, at least it was an offer. Argella would marry Aerys as Aegon had originally offered her father, and she would take Aerys' surname as her own. However, out of respect for her father's bravery, Aerys offered to retain both the words, sigil, and traditions of House Durrandon. The line of Storm Kings would continue through their children and their children's children. Once again, Argella didn't really have a choice in the matter. The princess became a lady, and House Baratheon was made Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. Argella pretty much drops from history at this point, but as far as we know, the marriage between her and Aerys was not a bad one. It may have even become a loving one, given that she would later go on to bear him 3 sons, to continue the Baratheon name. Either way, that was 2 kingdoms down, 5 to go. Next week, the conquest reaches its climax, with the Field of Fire, the surrender of the North and the Vale, and Aegon's official crowning at Old Town. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.